I have a real treat for you today. As you know, I've been here for over a week, and a name that keeps popping up in many different contexts is the name David Walker. And David Walker, I know that you can't see him right now on the camera, but is a kindergarten teacher at Mark Twain Elementary here in Westerville. And when I was first invited to come to Otterbein, I mentioned to my colleagues in the Department of Education that I knew Gail Walker, who's a music education professor here. And they said, "Oh, Gail, she isn't married to David Walker, is she?" And I said, "Yes, she is." Said, "Oh, David is this remarkable teacher that works with the Department of Education here." So I decided, well, when I arrived, not only did we have a lot of coffee and tea and catch up, I said it would be lovely for me to go to one of his classrooms. So on Tuesday morning, I went to go and visit his classroom. And as I say, he's a kindergarten teacher. And because I'm going to talk today about the African Storybook project. And I said to David, perhaps could he see what kids think of this African Storybook project in his kindergarten classroom. And so we kind of, in the classroom, did some collaborative teaching, actually. Because David, when you go to his classroom, he always puts you to work. You cannot sit in the corner taking notes. You walk in and say, "Now, this is what you need to do." So it turned out that I ended up teaching 2 of these stories to his little kindergarten kids, which was just an absolute treat for me. And then David taught the same stories in the afternoon class. So he has a morning and he has the afternoon. And of course, being David, he always takes things one step further, and he invited the children to write a response to the stories that they had heard. So as I was preparing for today's session, I thought, there's no way in the world I could do this on my own. So I thought, well, David's going to have to come and co-teach with me here. So he had to kind of squeeze out of here. He'd finished his morning session at Mark Twain, dashed over here. And in the meantime, he's been sending me scans of what the kids have been doing. And and then, of course, he's not going to be able to stay the whole session because, of course, he's heading back to his afternoon class. So we are so privileged because he's going to talk a little bit about the African Storybook project and how he incorporated it, into his classroom. And because he doesn't have much time, I'm not going to do much talking about it so that he has the time and we can talk later. But perhaps I could just say a couple of things. I've called this literacy, multilingualism, and young learners. And for the African Storybook project, you can YouTube. There's lots of information. What the Storybook project is a website where all kinds of stories are available freely for download with a focus on African children in English and also in multiple African languages. And I'll talk more about that. But I did want to just remind you in terms of like where my research is and what informs my research. I've got the Convention of the Rights of the Child right in front of me here. And just to remind you, 3 of these articles that speak very directly to my research. 1, you have the right to an identity, an official record of who you are, and no one should take this away from you. Article 13, you have the right to find out things and share what you think with others by talking, drawing, writing, or in any other way, unless it harms or offends other people. And Article 30, you have the right to practice your own culture, language, and religion. Minority and indigenous groups need special protection of this right. So what a wonderful set of principles to guide our teaching. And when we think about young children, because that's what we're addressing today, we're looking here particularly at what is called digital storytelling and multilingual literacy. Now, the 3 images that I have here, the one on the right, could be in a sense your typical, potentially perhaps an immigrant classroom, could be here in Westerville, where you would find children, these children might be from Poland, for example, learning English. So in a sense, they're learning English as a second language here in the US context, where they hear English all around them and learning from one another. Then the second image was taken in Uganda, where children are learning English as a second language, and the hope is also that they will maintain their mother tongue. And this is true, of course, for the children who could, for example, be from Poland. You don't want a child to learn English and then lose Polish, right? You want them to become multilingual. And the third image is a First Nations child up in Canada, and it could be a Native American child here, and the focus there is on retention of revitalization of languages. So I won't focus on that too much, but we can certainly talk later, because what I really want to do is hand you over to David. And so David, I don't know how you want to run this. This is all very organic, you know?
Start with the class.
So we are going to start with looking at one of the stories on the African Storybook project that David taught in his class. So David Walker. Okay, thank you. Should we give him a round of welcome? Okay. There we go.
There we go. Thank you. And it is so nice to be here. And it was absolutely a treat for my students to have Dr. Norton in the class with her. So first of all, I need you to understand that when we think of Westerville, Ohio, you might think of a class of, a bunch of little Caucasian kids and who all speak English. But in my class in the morning, I have 26 students, 11 of whom English is not their first language. The parents don't speak English as the language at home. So for them, this multilingualism, it's really alive and vibrant. And there's two things I like particularly about the African Story Project, and it has to do with widening the culture of the stories the kids see. It's very important that you have a very broad and diverse set of stories for the kids to read. I mean, I look for stories from things like Townsend Press, which has a King series about African families in an urban setting. But it's very important that you look for these. And I was particularly intrigued also by the language here. And so let's sort of just read this first book to you. And I think you're going to catch on a little bit of what we happen. So it says, clouds can bring rain. I like clouds. Clouds can bring snow. I like clouds. Clouds can hide the sun. I like clouds. Clouds can hide the stars. I like clouds. That's the end of the book, really. It's simple. But when you're starting to teach kids to read, you sort of need a little very simple text. Now, what was so nice is in my morning class, I've got kids who know their ABCs, and that's about it. And I've got kids who can read quite well and who could read the story. But with the repetitive text, with the prediction there, once the first page was read to them, the whole class could participate in the reading. So it really did become a whole class participatory reading. This and that. The images were good. They were clear in everything for the students. We talked about the number of words, the number of sentences. In terms of where we are in our kindergarten right now, trying to write 2 sentences is actually what the goal was right now with our kids. So it really worked into that. So sort of where I'm going to get to next is how we then have our kids respond to it. If I can find it right over there.
That's the morning class.
Yeah, that's the morning class. So, see if we can, there we go. So this is Khalid, okay? So instead of doing about I like clouds, and by the way, actually, first the kids in all the classes said, hey, clouds can do other things, and they really talked about shapes. And we had a great time talking about clouds and shapes. But then we said, what other things are useful? And the kids immediately thought of trees. So as the response we did to this, we said, well, that book was about clouds and what they like, and we said we could write a similar book about trees. And so this is Khalid, and he wrote his story. It was dictation. I know it's hard to guess what that is, but that's monkeys. Monkeys can play in trees. Khalid was so proud of this. He's talking and talking and wanting to share it with us. But to him, that's what trees are and what they can do. This is Janisha, another girl for whom English isn't her first language. But this is all Janisha's writing. And obviously she's a good student. Trees can be good for climbing. I like trees. So for her, the fun is you can go and climb a tree. Evan, trees can make us swings. I like trees. But you can see how it went right into the, I mean, before this week, they hadn't, everything was only one sentence. The book provided the framework and the structure of how could we do two sentences? Where do the periods go and this and that? So it was a huge leap that they actually made as a class this week. You know, normally they would just be doing that one sentence up on top. But you can see how they responded to it. Panisha, oh, I like, she learned this from her dad, she said. Trees can bring oxygen. I like trees. I said, Panisha, how do you do it? She says, Dad says they need oxygen. And it's actually quite pertinent. Her grandfather is on an oxygen, I know he's on an oxygen breathing apparatus. So, you know, it's important to them. And then Madeline, I think the last one we'll share. Tree can be for a picnic. I like tree, okay? So, you know, obviously one way, as we use the African Story Project, is use it as a framework to help the kids to respond and for them to do it, which you would do as a good literacy activity with any set of children, but talking about what they like. Now the next story I wanted to go to from the African Story Project, and we might have to quickly...
The African Storybook at the top.
Right there, right there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we might have to go back to that. And
I enjoy.
yeah, we might have to go. I enjoy. In many different languages. So
Right.
There isn't English.
No, this is the bilingual text. This is the one I think we should have.
That's Setswana.
What?
A little difficult.
Let me just see.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
It provides the English along with it.
right. It's bilingual. You're right. Now this the kids liked. I'm not going to try to read it for you, but I sort of pretended that I read it to the kids and used that as this and that. It's good for them to just hear this and that, to hear other languages. But what I really like is it starts with, I enjoy skipping rope. We had a good 3 to 5 minute discussion on how would we say that in our classroom. We wouldn't say, I enjoy skipping rope. Those kids would say, I like jumping rope. You know, that's how they would say it in their class. But one of my students, who, for her parents, her English is good, but English is her second language, she immediately pops up and says, oh, Mr. Walker, it's okay. You could say the same thing with lots of different words. And she figures that out. And it's important for them to hear it. For them to hear, hey, there's another way to express I like. We don't need it. I enjoy. That it's skipping rope. And so I like that variety of language and the variety of perspectives it gives. So we'll just go through this book. I enjoy skipping rope. Alone. I enjoy skipping it with my friend. 2. I enjoy reading interesting stories. And again, on this page, we talked about the kids would say, I like reading books. And we talked about the difference between a story and a book and what was inside. And they figured out that story was actually a much better word. They liked the word story better than they liked book. I enjoyed walking in the field with my friends. I enjoy washing utensils for my mother. Think about the word utensils in a 5 and a 6-year-old. But then we also went back and we talked about what all these things were that were right here that she was holding, which were words that they were familiar, but they didn't have that grouping word, utensils. I enjoy writing big letters that I can read easily. And I enjoy eating different fruit. I enjoy sleeping on a big bed. I mean, I can't really keep going without mentioning the illustrations are just wonderful for the kids. I mean, they absolutely love it. Might not pick up to you back there, but these are stars all in the background. So it's like the kid is sleeping. You know, they said it's like they're sleeping on the sky. That's what the kids talked about. And they just, you know, it's beautiful to them. Or as Bonnie would say, fabulous. And I enjoy listening to Mother telling interesting stories. And it came back to stories here, stories in a book. And they really, I can hear them say, oh, can we have another story? Instead of, they had been saying until this week, can we have another book? They realized story is what they like. Story is really what they relate to. And ooh, I enjoy doing all these things. So in the afternoon class, I mean, the response, afternoon? Yeah. All I wrote up there was I enjoy. So we talked about that word enjoy, and of course, you know, we got it right from the book. Now I wanted to start with this one on purpose, because this is from Edna. And Edna is also a student where English is her second language, and it sort of speaks right away to the African Story Project. She says, I enjoy watching on a Kindle. It's right there what she wants. I said, watching? She says, yeah. Now, and I asked her, watching, I said, do you watch TV? She says, no, on a Kindle is for reading. She knows it's for reading. It's not where she's watching PBS Kids or things. She says, that's what I do. I like to read stories, and that's how she reads them at her home on a Kindle. And another one sort of talking to the technology. Can we bring this over a little bit, Bonnie? I think it, there we go. I enjoy playing on my mommy's phone, in the car. You know, the technology can go with you anywhere. And there he is, playing in his car. Claire's picture. It's beautiful. I enjoy going for ice cream with my brother and my sister. Take that home and you're probably going to get an ice cream treat from your parents. And you just have to. Michaela. She's got all the bikinis and everything. But, but English is not her first language either. I enjoy swimming in the water with my mom and dad, grandma and brother. You know. And the last one we'll share is, I enjoy having sleepovers with my cousins. What the African Story Project really, you can just see it in the kids' faces, is how well it broadens their perspective in our school, how well they can see these books. And then, of course, since they're here and they're online, we talk about technology. And at least in Westerville, and a lot of our kids come from Columbus. I've done home visits since I came here in about 2000. And in 2000, technology was something that was not in every home. What has been amazing is the last 3 years, technology has really been, I haven't been to a home that doesn't have technology in it. Every single home I've been to, there's some kind of a desktop computer or a laptop, and the parents have cell phones. So they can take these stories, and they can read them at home with their mom and dad right away. I'll put it in my newsletter on Monday, and say, this is the link, and a lot of the kids will find them. And it's sort of the same way that, you know, we hope for it to work with kids in other countries. So, you know, it works with them, it relates to them, it broadens their language. And then the last thing is, it is important for the kids to see themselves in these pictures, to see themselves. And so for the students, you know, I've got 8 students from Africa in my class. For them to see their culture, to see them, I don't bring it up and we don't talk about, oh, this is Edna. No, no, no. It's just, this is the story. This is the story for the class. This is the story we all enjoy, and they all enjoy it. But yet I can see in those students, in their faces and in their expressions, it's sort of a validation, and it's a feel-good. I see myself in it. So that's there.
David, thank you so much for going. You're not going yet. You do have a few minutes. David,
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Can we just, because David's going to have to leave, so can we just, do you have questions for David before
or comments.
he has to leave, or comments, or any contributions, or, yeah.
Thought I got to run. No, I'm kidding.
Because I know that everyone is trying to work with all the plurality of the classrooms and
Right.
the diversity. How you handle, for example, how you're able to handle different needs in each child. For example, you have limited time, expectations, from
Right.
the main office, and you might have a child that has a delay or special needs child. How you balance it out?
I mean, we certainly in this same classroom where we have special needs children. So kids, who, IQs are very low and this and that. Sort of that first book, iClouds, but even both of these have patterns. Having a pattern in a text is a huge way to help it. So if you saw with Khalid, if you go back to that first one, Khalid just drew his picture. Okay, it had to be dictation. Khalid, he doesn't have his letters and stuff yet. So, it had to be as a dictation. To other kids, you can see they were writing the multiple sentences by themselves. I didn't show you any of them, but the paper was there on the back. There were some kids who did 4 pages. There were some kids who wrote 1 page. So you have to have an open-ended kind of an assignment. So that I have to know in my head already, how am I going to address it? And sort of writing really is a fabulous way to do it, so that I can go from taking dictation to letting a kid write 4 paragraphs, and sort of everyone can do it in between. Now, in terms of me as one person getting around all the kids, then sometimes I train other students to be their helpers. I'm very blessed with some absolutely fantastic Otterbein students who are in my room. Really, you guys are awesome who come to my room. So, I had an Otterbein student with me this morning as we were doing the lessons, and parents, though Otterbein students are better. We'll just go there.
Can I ask you a question,
Sure.
Dave? What do you do about feedback on these stories? And yeah, that's a huge question already.
Right.
But I know that certainly parents have a range of responses to the kind of feedback that they expect a teacher might give on these stories. So just on the written component, what do you do with that?
The feedback when these go home from the parents?
Yeah, exactly. Do you
They-
send them no comments from you or comments from you or?
No, generally I don't put comments on them, and if I do, it would be a personal comment because I know the family. So, like the one about ice cream, I'd put it at the bottom and say, I want a double dip chocolate cone. Or double dip chocolate cone, please. The parents in general, though, are very excited about the kids' writing. I mean, when we sit down and have a conference, when we talk, nearly always the first thing that comes up is, hey, my kid brought this story home. I mean, they are so excited, actually, when these pages go home. The parents love it. Dr. Knobloch, because I had both of her kids in kindergarten. Did you like reading it when the stories?
And they have a homework folder, so all the
Right.
writing will go in the homework folder.
And
the first thing my girls wanted to do is show me the homework folder.
show them the homework,
and to
share them the
show
writing.
what they wrote that day and what they drew, and just very, very excited.
Yeah, the parents love the writing. And with the kid who takes dictation, the parent loves that too. They want to know what it's about. So there's not an issue. There's an excitement about it, which will actually get them to more likely to then go look at the websites and read the stories, because that's sort of, they need something tangible to bring it up to them. So, anything else?
David, I have another question. So you never attempt to correct those?
No.
Are there any parents who say, this isn't proper English, or this isn't spelled correctly? Do they never say anything like that?
Not after we've had curriculum night. So we have that the first week of school. And no, the expectations are set. I set them pretty strong. But about it, it's the children's spelling, and I talk about book spelling and we talk about phonetic spelling, and I tell them, and the parents know, when the child writes, the child is sending you a message. The most important thing is what they're trying to say. But as the teacher, you're always looking at what they write, and they're sending the message of what level they are, where they are in the continuum in the writing process. And so I learn how well they know phonics. I usually learn from their writing, you know, everything else. Now, do I ever correct them? Yes, but it's very much on an individual basis, which kid is ready for it and which kid isn't. So it's really when the child starts to read more independently, and it's more of a conversation. Hey, have you noticed, you know, when there's something in the past tense, there's an ED, or there's an S on it, or what letters are you missing? But it's never going to be blanket for all the kids. It's always going to be geared to that one kid, because that's what that one kid is ready for. And it would only be one thing I would correct. I wouldn't try to make the whole sentence perfect. But I would pick one thing.
So the practice of interactive writing.
Yes.
Many teachers will, that's a public composition done by usually the whole group, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
And you share the pen.
Yes, that would.
And I know lots of teachers who will use boo-boo tape.
Yes.
When the child has tried to spell but not done it, you know, dictionary spelling. How do you handle that?
So we do the interactive writing. At this point of the year, we're doing less of it. We do a ton of it in August, September, and October, sort of to do it. The boo-boo tape, I really reserve for when the kid who has the marker wants to change something. Because, you know, the marker, you have to use a marker instead of a pencil just so that the other 25 kids can see. And if the kid says, oh, I didn't want to do that letter, I wanted to do another letter, absolutely, let's do the boo-boo tape. And actually, if we go back to Edna's picture, there's boo-boo tape on her picture because she drew something wrong. I don't use the interactive writing. I will not correct it to book spelling. Absolutely not. If the kid who's up there wants to do it, and we talk about it, that's the way. And to the child who might be sitting in the audience, sitting in my floor, who says, "I know how to spell can," and he spelled it just with a K, and I know, and no other letters, and I know it's C-A-N. I said, "That's great. You can spell it on your paper how you want to." But I want them to respond. So I'm not. You're the one with the marker, and when it's the other kid's turn with the marker, they can do it that way. But I do use. They do make their own mistakes, and they started. Oh, I didn't want to make a T. I wanted to make a J. So okay, no problem. Let's just put the tape on it. That's what I do. Anything else? Good. Keep coming to Mark Twain Elementary.
Well, thank you, David. I really appreciate this because David did this under very short notice. But in a sense, that's so much of teaching is done that way, right? You've got to respond, but I owe you one.
I'll see you. We'll see you this afternoon.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. I just thought it was really interesting. I hope you enjoyed that, because of course we're talking about the African Storybook Project, we're talking about literacy, we're talking about multilingualism, and sometimes, you know, when I talk about my research that I do in Africa, people think, well, it's out there somewhere, not really that relevant to what we're doing here. But it's very relevant because in many ways through the digital world we can share resources that we would otherwise never be able to share 10 years ago. But also I think the point that David mentioned very poignantly is those kids in the class. You know, those kids, diversity, you raised the question about diversity, right? You don't knock people over the head, you know, but there's the nuance, the subtlety. There's kids of all different backgrounds, right? And here happens to be a story. So I think that's part of how we respond to diversity. I mean, obviously, there are many different ways of doing it, but certainly this is one important way. And yeah, I don't know whether it was coincidence or not, but quite frankly, after I had given my two little stories, I told you that morning did the two little stories, the two little kids who kind of came and took my hand. They were both from Somalia, one on one side, one on the other side, and walked with me. And took my hand. So just obviously the sense of connection, I think. Okay, so that was kind of a rather informal kind of, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the kind of formal, like the curriculum. I love David's concept of, we had to have the curriculum night. So I mean, that's a very important point, because what he's saying is you have to manage expectations. You know, parents come to to class, they send their kids, they trust their kids to you, and in the end they do want the kids to, at some point, be good writers, good readers, and certainly also in English, because in America, in the States, English is the official language. So that is something every parent wants. On the other hand, they also want their child to be happy. They want their child to feel a sense of place. They want their child to have a safe classroom where they can take risks. So sometimes, you know, there's got to be a little negotiation. And so what David was describing in the curriculum night, really, is, for example, very simply, you know, spelling, for example. And what he's saying, and I think such a powerful point, and it's certainly absolutely central to all my work, is what is the message that the child is trying to send. And this relates also to reading as well, because one of the problems kids have with reading, young kids have, is that, and I love the description of the book versus the story, because many young kids think, as they learn, I'm going to talk more about it today when I talk about Archie comics, is that they think that good reading is you've got to read every word correctly, you know. But what people do, and then of course if they don't understand a word, they get stuck, and they might drop it, they might not come back to it, they might say, I'm a bad reader. Because what they think is that reading is about is you've got to read every word, it's got to be correct. What they need to learn is that reading is about meaning making. It's precisely about the story. It's not about the book. The book is an artifact. It's the story that has the meaning. And so I just love, I've never heard David talk about, you know, that kids are saying, you know, we read books, but now they're saying we read stories. I mean, that's a huge difference, right? You read a book, you open a chapter book, there's certain rules and regulations. You read a story, it has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end, it has people, it has meaning, it has change, it has excitement. So in a sense, if the African Storybook Project is encouraging kids to think about stories rather than books, I think it's already a huge achievement. But let's just look at this, for example, you know, what I found quite interesting, remember the story, you know, I like clouds, right? So David was saying that you have that repetition, you know. So what I found, and this, I don't know if this was, this might have been, you know, written or perhaps, I don't exactly know how David navigated that, but in all of these, I like trees, it's all correct. Every one of these kids wrote, I like trees, just like I like clouds. So it's almost as if, you know, in a sense, that repetition was helpful for these kids in terms of writing, you know, standard English, right? But then, of course, you know, they're going to be, I can make, what is that? Trees can make swings. Okay, now that's what we call transitional spelling, right? So, and we need to explain to, you know, we need to explain to parents that you know, kids do go through a transition, right? And they will become increasingly proficient. And that's an example of transitional spelling. So, you know, just very interesting how, you know, David incorporated, in a sense, if we're thinking of literacy, right? Literacy as being both reading and writing. It's very interesting to see how he incorporated the reading component and the writing component in, I think, a very creative way. So going from I like clouds, lovely, to I like trees. Why not? And something that certainly all the kids can relate to, but adds a new dimension to that notion. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint here, and let's have a look where I am. Okay, so, there we go. Here we go. Let's pull this down here. And, okay. So I just put these images in here just in case we, you know, we wanted to take another look at them. Interesting, one of the things we've done with the African Storybook is because, as you saw, it takes a little bit of time to download the story and for the images to shift. Some of our stories we do just in black and white outline, because that means you can do that very quickly, that, you know, that doesn't need so much broadband. But also kids can color in. You know, teachers can print it out, and then they can color in. So again, that's quite an innovative use of the African Storybook. So here these kids were, of course, you know, making their own drawings, but in the African Storybook, you can actually just print out the whole story and you can color in. Okay, monkeys. Right. So now we're going to go a little bit more into a little bit of theory, if you'll bear with me, and you can certainly continue the conversation. But what I want to talk a little bit is about some of the theoretical logic, you know, of the Storybook project. And that is the notion of multimodality, which is very important for young children, and in fact, young, old, all kids, all parents as well, and young adults. In any communicative mode, language, whether written or spoken, is only partial to the meaning-making process. So there are many ways in which meaning is communicated. And this is partly, I think, what David was saying. And that integral to this new agenda is understanding how cultures select from and choose to develop particular multimodal possibilities for communication. So what I wanted to draw to your attention here is that what we have, is certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, is a major crisis. Because, let's see how well and you can, oh, wait a minute, I've actually haven't, I need a pointer over here, but that's okay. Let's have a look. At the top, what you see here, you see a pencil, and then you see like a darker mark, and then you see, you know, just a thinner mark. So what that means is that if we look at the North American context, which is the bottom pencil here, 96% of children in North America stay in school till grade 4 and achieve minimum reading standards. 40% of children in sub-Saharan Africa stay in school till grade 4 and achieve minimum reading standards. So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, which is, we go down 1, 2, 3 down, you can see it at the top. So that's huge in terms of the needs certainly in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see why we have a problem here. The pencil mark, by the way, shows you, where you see the actual pencil, shows you the 40%. Then the dark line shows you that kids are still in school, but they are not, there's very little learning taking place. And then after that, kids are no longer in school. So you can see, in a sense, the lost potential for these children. And what you see here is not, of course, only in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South and West Asia. There are major problems too. Things get better when you hit Latin America and Central Asia and Eastern Europe and so forth, and certainly North America and Western Europe. But in sub-Saharan Africa, we are greatly concerned. And in fact, what you see here is a legacy. 1/4 of those aged 14 to 24 in poor countries are unable to read a single sentence. So you can imagine how people's lives are limited by the challenge that they are confronting. So that's why the work that I've been doing in sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly in Uganda, looks at literacy and the affordances of digital literacy to increase reading opportunities for young people. So what we see here is an image. This is a group of young teenage children, really, all centered around just one computer and attempting to learn the computer and reading. I'm working with teachers. I do a great deal of work with teachers. But what you see in this one image of the young girl and her younger sister is how children are helping one another. That's very common in the African context. And what you see in the fourth image here is solar power. Solar power is something that people are harnessing for social change. So if we look at mother tongue literacy, which is something that we're encouraging in the African Storybook project, the argument is that there's ample research showing that students are quicker to learn to read and acquire other academic skills when first taught in their mother tongue. They also learn a second language more quickly than those initially taught to read in an unfamiliar language. So this is absolutely crucial for those of you who are going to confront children in your classes who come from many different language groups, often parents think when children enter school, the first thing they've got to do is they've got to learn English as quickly as possible. And they don't actually, many often the parents and sometimes teachers do not value the mother tongue. But what the research shows is that, in fact, if children can become literate in the mother tongue, the transition to English or another majority language is that much easier for the child. And the work of Jim Cummins has been absolutely central in this regard. So what Jim Cummins talks about, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday at another meeting, was what he calls the interdependence hypothesis. In other words, by learning in one language, you are actually also supporting learning in another language. He's looked at literacy engagement, that in fact, if kids engage in literacy, and the research in Europe demonstrates that if children engage actively with print, that more so than any other factor will help them deal with issues of social class and inequities of social class. He looks at power as something that is collaborative. So when you look at David's classroom, what you see is him working very collaboratively with the children to promote reading and meaning making, and to kind of negotiate with them. Okay, so you want to make this change, that's fine. And if somebody else wants to do it slightly differently, that's okay too. So he is giving children a sense of ownership over their own learning processes. Cummins also talks about BICS and KELP, the distinction between basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. And with basic interpersonal communication skills, children can acquire basic communication skills in 1 to 2 years. But to develop cognitive academic language proficiency, where you are dealing with more complex language and more cognitively demanding language, that can take 5 or 6 years. And teachers sometimes think, and parents sometimes think, once children are competent in just conversational English, they're fine. But in fact, children often need scaffolding in academic English as well. And then the final point that Cummins makes is that identity texts, that when you get, for example, children, and the examples that we saw of those children make drawing, right, the swings, or, you know, the family outings, you know, he would call, and he and Margaret Corley would call those identity texts, where the child is reflecting himself or herself and her family, in a sense, in a positive light. So how can we also encourage the development of these identity texts that students can relate to? So this is where we have the notion of the interdependence model, the differences between the first language and second language. We still have a common underlying proficiency. What we need for literacy engagement is abundant access to printed texts. So what the African Storybook Project does is to have multiple texts. And as you saw, that one story, I Enjoy, had in fact many different languages. I know it's in Kiswahili, I think it's in Uganda, it's in Setswana. So the beauty of going digital is that you can take one text and you can translate it into many other languages. So that in fact, in your classes, you may not have African languages, but you may have certainly Spanish, you may have Nepalese, I think that was another language in David's class. You can take one of those stories and you can simply translate it into another language. And this could be available for children in other classrooms in your schools or in classrooms in other schools. So again, that's the power of the digital to make abundant access to printed text, and also active engagement with these texts. So I wonder, I might come back and play this little clip. You can do it on YouTube, by the way. You can just simply Google Bonny Norton YouTube African Storybook Project. So I might just hold off on that and take you through a number of texts that are actually on the storybook. But the person who's working, who is the project director, is Tessa Welch. And there is also a YouTube presentation by her, and she's at the South African Institute for Distance Education in South Africa. I'm, in fact, the research advisor on this project. And I'm not going to play that for you now, but I'll just give you the goals then, is to create and encourage the use of openly licensed stories for the first few years of reading in digital format. And what's beautiful, what's really wonderful about this project is you can not only download stories, you know, just as David and I did now, but also you can upload new stories. So that also gives a sense of ownership, you know, as people create their own stories and their own illustrations. And Diane Ross, who's a professor of education here at Otterbein, is in Uganda at the moment, and she just sent me just yesterday 4 stories that she and her group have developed using the African Storybook project, and we'll be uploading these in due course. So of course, so it's a very interactive website. So you can share versions of stories in local languages. You've got in Africa, you have, you know, hundreds of different languages, so that's why the digital is very helpful. But the important point here is to create a firm basis for literacy development in the mother tongue and the official language. So what you're looking at here, and this is what I think is so powerful about David's presentation, is that it's not just the reading that is important, but it's also the writing. And in fact, when it comes to assessment for many children and many young people in North America and the international community, people get assessed on their writing. That seems to be one of the most common forms of assessment, is through writing. And this is something, as parents were saying, you know, the parents are very eager to see is that writing process. I won't go through it at the moment. We're looking here at the countries we're working in is Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa. And I've got a whole research team working with me at the University of British Columbia, and also a very strong group of graduate students as well. Espen Stranger Johansson is currently, has just returned from Uganda, and he is the website coordinator of the blog that we have developed for the African Storybook project. And this is one of my colleagues, Marlene Aslan. And this is just an example of, this is a group of us got together. This was about 18 months ago to launch the website and to launch the project in South Africa. And there is a YouTube on that particular event. And just have a look here that in the African context, what you see is people use cell phones, and David mentioned cell phones, and these are becoming increasingly powerful in the African context. We also have on-demand printing, very cheap printers, and then with a digital projector, you know, you can have a class of this size, and often 80 kids in a class, and with a digital projector, you can reach many children. So again, what you see here is the expandability here. So we initially started with 120 stories and then developed these in multiple languages. But there's always the local language, there's always the language English, because if you didn't have one common language, nobody would know, how, you know, very few people would be able to translate it. So every story has to be available in an African tongue as well as English. That's why you can go in, and we were able to use it here because nobody, you know, none of those kids understood Setswana or Kiswahili, but they did understand English. So you can see many of the languages that we're working with here. What I wanted to show also, and this is what's so interesting about this project, is that we have partners, of course, in different parts of the world, one of which is in India. And in India, there's a huge push, again, to encourage literacy in Indian society. And there we have, I think, roughly 1 billion people, right? And many, many, many children needing to learn to become literate. As you saw on that one image at the beginning, South Asia, literacy is certainly a major challenge. So we are partnering, and people want to learn from this particular model that we have developed on the African Storybook. And I was actually in New Zealand about a year ago, and many people in New Zealand were interested in using a model like this for their many different indigenous languages in New Zealand. And of course, the native American languages here in the US could be all, you know, uploaded on a website like this. So here we have the notion here of language, according to Jim Cummins, where you find BICS, the distinction between BICS and KELP, where you have cognitively undemanding language would be BICS, and then the cognitively demanding would be KELP. And I'm going to now show you how you can transform a text. I found it interesting, David mentioned that when we had that one image of the utensil, that's a tough word for kindergarten kids. So how are you going to make that word understandable? And I'm going to show you how, through the African Storybook, we attempted to work with BICS and KELP to transform the stories. So that, for example, here was a very sweet story, Nozibele and the 3 Hares. So the story is, a long time ago, 3 girls went out to collect wood. Now, the original story had, when they had collected enough wood, they tied it into bundles and put it on their heads. What we did with this story is to simplify it and simply say, a long time ago, 3 girls went out to collect wood. And of course, what you see very clearly through the images is all the information that is captured multimodally rather than through text. I mean, I found it interesting that David said with the students he's working with that some of them just drew one little picture and had maybe 1 or 2 words. Others had 4 pages. So, you know, at some level, you need to have a sufficiently organic exercise for young learners so that those who can advance can do so, but those who are still learning will have a way to connect with the text. So this is just a wonderful way, multimodally, that kids can connect with the text. And also you could ask lots of questions, you know, you could have, you know, what are the girls doing and what are they carrying on their heads and how are they doing it? And it may be that down the line you could have a second version of this very same text where you could have the text embedded. And by then, of course, the meaning potential has already been articulated. Here we have a dual language text. A lovely story, right, with an image. And so you see the two, the languages side by side, right? The hoe was too short, the doorway was too short, the bed was too short, the mat was too short, the bicycle was too short, the rat was too short, the man was too tall. So very interesting. So you have the repetition that David was saying is really wonderful, right? You know, I like clouds, I like clouds. But there is also the introduction of new vocabulary. So there is a frame that is familiar to the child, but then there is also a new vocabulary embedded in a meaningful way, right? And here you also have a very sweet image for the child. The man was too tall. He made a very long hoe handle. He fixed it on a very long hoe. He made a very long door frame and made a very long bed. Sorry, this image is a little bit obscured. The bed was too short. The mat was too short. You could imagine, you know, the wonderful conversations. In fact, when I was teaching one of these stories a couple of days ago, we had lovely conversations about, you know, what is the little boy looking at, you know, and who else is in the picture, and what color, you know, is the bed frame, and you can imagine the lovely conversations that you can have using images. And also the notion is that what you're doing is focusing on the meaning. So it's not the bed was too short, although at some point you're going to need to do that. But there's the meaning, it's right there. Why is the tall man sleeping in a short bed? And you could develop wonderful stories around that. We also, in my own research, many of you know that I'm interested in issues of identity. And so the questions of identity that this project lends itself to a number of questions on identities, such as how is learner and teacher identity implicated in the writing, reading, and sharing of digital stories? And what or whose investments are at stake in schools, homes, and communities? So I'm not going to, we can open this up. I hope we're going to have a conversation, because we have till 1:30, is that correct? That's correct, thank you. So I'm hoping you're all getting lots of questions ready, everybody. So, I mean, this is a very interesting question. How is learner identity and how is teacher identity implicated in the writing, reading, and sharing of these stories. And I hope we're going to be able to come back to that in our discussion. And what or whose investments are at stake in schools, and note everybody, homes and communities. We get then to the notion of identity texts. And in fact, what Jim Cummins and Margaret Earley argue here, they incorporate the notion of investment that I have used in my own work to say that children need to be invested in the text that they read and that they create. Identity texts refer to artifacts that students produce. Students take ownership of these artifacts as a result of having invested their identities in them. So by just looking at the images that those students produce in David's class, very interesting to see how do we make sense? I was going through, I read through all those stories, and in this particular case, he was showing you the language learners in the class. And I read all the stories. And you got in every single case a different image of the child, quite frankly, by reading all these stories. Like, who does the child go shopping with? Who is buying the child's clothes, And there was one image, and I think it might be one that David shared. There was a lovely image where the child said, I go shopping with my mom. And then kind of squeezed in, and my dad, and then squeezed in, and brother. As if the child says, oh, mustn't forget the dad, mustn't forget the brother, Just lovely how these were constructed. And you can almost see the kind of process that the child is going through. Once produced, these texts, which are written, they can be spoken, they can be visual, musical, or combinations of all of these in multimodal form, hold up a mirror to the student in which his or her identity is reflected back in a positive light. So in many ways, we were looking at numbers of identity texts. Here we have, for example, how many people have heard of Alexander McCall Smith? Yeah, the Ladies Detective Agency?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So that's Alexander McCall Smith. So he has donated 2 of his stories to this project, the African Storybook Project. This one is called, in fact, Children of Wax. And what you see here is children's kind of, in a sense, their imagined identities in many ways. One of the boys longed to go out in the sunlight. So what we have here is we have the boy, we have the story by McCall Smith, but then you have that same story translated, of course, into 1 or more languages. Let's have a look at this particular story. And I've called it Identity Text and Troubling Images. Now, what you do, when you see a trouble, so this image here, what we have here is the man sped home. It's about, it's called The Girl with One Breast. And it was about a man, I think, who fell in love with another woman, and then the other woman, I think, might have got AIDS, perhaps. And then the man went back home and chopped off. The man sped home, picked up a knife, pounced on his wife, and the breast was off instantly, I think, to give to the new love in his life. I can't remember the exact story. But the point being that this was a very troubling story. So when you take an oral story and you actually convert it to text, it certainly does become very troubling. And as I was saying to David just last night, we have, don't we have, the grandmother that gets eaten by the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood? Yeah, and don't we have stories about, the 2 little Hansel and Gretel who end up in the oven, And we have very troubling stories, actually, in English. But nevertheless, when you take an oral story and you convert it into written form, it in many ways, changes its meaning. It certainly the immediacy and the acts perhaps become perhaps that much more visible. And so then the question becomes, what kind of text is appropriate for a young child, right? And who's going to make the decision of what is appropriate for a young child? And here's another example of that. Then the dog said, "Sleep with me." "I've never slept with a dog before," said Nozibele. "Sleep with me or I'll bite you," said the dog. So Nozibele slept with the dog. And this was a story from Nozibele and the Three Hares. So again, somewhat troubling. Of course, we do have these images, of course, of, you know, the three little bears and and also the house that got burnt down. But so again, you know, these are issues, right, that we struggle with. And who decides what children should read and at what level and at what stage? The issue here of access, of ownership and open access is also very important. And what I wanted to draw your attention to here was that all these stories here are, because they're available open access, they're available through what is called Creative Commons. And what that means is that every story is freely available, but whoever uses it needs to attribute, it needs to attribute who wrote it, you know, who was the writer, and, you know, who was the author, who was the illustrator. And that is what Creative Commons is. So, for example, here we see, for example, Rafilu and the Washed Chickens. We see the writer, Marion Drew, and the illustrator, Bihanda Yacher. And you see the date, and it's got their Creative Commons. So what we see with children's stories is the illustrator is terribly important. You know, sometimes we think, you know, text is just like the author, who wrote the book. But we know that certainly for children's stories and youth, the illustrator is terribly important, and the meaning for many children is within the text. So, so it is acknowledged. It is acknowledged here in the African Storybook, but it's done so through Creative Commons. What we also have here is some of the complexities around translation. So I wanted to show you an example of this. So we have this story in English, which I will just read the first part, that goes, "I dance when I'm happy, I dance when I'm sad. I dance when I'm lonely, I dance when I'm mad." Lovely little rhythm, right? Then the story gets translated into Lusoga. Now, I don't know Lusoga, but you see Lusoga here, you know, on the right. But when you take the literal translation of that story, which is in Lusoga, and translate it back into English, in a sense, or in other, what does it sound like to a Lusoga speaker? It becomes, dancing is very good. Dancing is so amusing. It amuses so many people, even when someone is annoyed. So do you see how the whole meaning shifts? The loss of repetition, in a sense, the loss of enjoyment in many ways, you know, of the rhythm and the rhyme that is so engaging in the story. So these are, you know, some of the complexities of translation. And the question that I would, in a sense, like to leave you with here, but I'm going to, at least not leave you, but open up for discussion, is how do we support teachers, parents, and communities to use digital stories effectively? And how do we mediate digital stories with children? So this is the research that I'm currently doing with projects like the African Storybook Project in Africa. But for the purposes of discussion here, I'm going to take you back to the issues around identity. And what I'm going to do, because this is a large room, is I'm going to give you an opportunity, which just maybe for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, you can turn to the person next to you. And I want you to talk about this question: how is learner and teacher identity implicated in the writing, reading, and sharing of digital stories? That is the question. So I'm just going to give you then 3 or 4, 2, 3 minutes talk to the person next to you. You can talk 2 or 3 people together, and I'd like you to address that question. And then let's have a little bit of an open discussion around this question. What were some of your comments? What are some of your insights in your groups? Any contributions? Yeah.
We were talking about how teachers will have to label a student's identity to help them fulfill their imagined identities.
Okay. Did you hear that at the back? No. Could you? It's a lovely thought, right? Do you want to just stand up, maybe? Take over the lesson?
So we were just talking about how it's more important for a student or a teacher to label, to to not label a student with an identity, but to allow them to fulfill their imagined identity.
Through reading.
Through reading.
And visual.
Lovely. Would you like to elaborate on that? Because I know that some people have been to some of my other sessions, and some people haven't. Would you like to elaborate?
Well, at all the events that I've been to of yours and at the ESL panel that we had and she came and spoke at,
Do you want to stand up? Because sorry about not to put a light on you, just that I'm sure people would be interested, I hope. Right.
We discussed how rather than having an ELL, English language learner, think of themselves as only that, to give them another identity, say in an extracurricular activity. So if they love soccer, they love basketball, encourage them to go be on that team. Give them books about that sport. Let them immerse them into something else rather than just being that ELL. Help them find another identity, so then they find that other identity, they can become more integrated into the school community rather than an outsider.
That's a lovely, thank you. That's a wonderful observation, because one of the issues that has arisen in discussions I've had with people, and certainly is the case in many schools internationally, is that silos develop in schools. You know, kids are stick together in groups, and there isn't enough kind of integration and sharing, and also kids get stereotyped quite often, right? This is an ESL, you know, this is an ESL, this is an immigrant, right? Or this is this kind of kid. So rather than essentializing that child, what you want other children to do is to see the multiple identities that that child might have. Not only as an ESL learner, but maybe somebody, for example, who's great at drawing. Boy, there were some lovely, lovely images there. Maybe even a great writer for that matter. Maybe even soccer. Somebody said they love to, go and play soccer. So that child then develops, a range of identities, and is not essentialized just as, oh, that's an immigrant learner, right? Or that's an ESL. So then the extension of that is that, of course, reading stories would be lovely. Stories about soccer, stories about music, whatever that, so that that child can see herself or himself in those stories, but that other kids can also perhaps see the multiplicities of identities that kids can have. So sharing stories, and what we were talking about, kids' imagined identities. They may come and say, I feel bad because people don't like me. Why don't they like me? I don't know. They don't like my hair, whatever it might be. So what you want to do is let's develop. Let's look at other kinds of identities that might be more powerful for that child, and develop a relationship and develop a community in the class. Okay, thank you for that. Other comments? Other comments about learner and teacher identity? Yes.
What if the teacher identity and the child identity, you're creating a very nice, safe classroom. What if the society around you doesn't agree? For example, in sexual orientations,
right.
or the role of female in the culture, right. How do you deal with that when you were in Africa or other countries that you encountered that?
Right. So, that's a very important question. First of all, you may be able to create a safe environment, right, in a school, but what happens when kids leave school? Well, you see, I'll go back to David, quite frankly, and he talks about the curriculum meeting, I think he said. Now, we can't, of course, reach everybody all the time, right? But even just reaching the parents is a start. So when those parents come, to their curriculum meeting on the, first Tuesday of the month, whenever that might be in the school, and you talk to the parents about, this is the kind of community we want our school to be. This is the identity of our school. Because when people think of identity, they think a person has an identity, and yes, we do. But schools also have identities. And in fact, David is from Mark Twain, as it turns out, and he says the identity of the school is one in which people embrace diversity, where there's a comfort level that is not only in the classroom, but is also outside. In fact, I was in the playground on Tuesday, and what I saw were not kids sticking together. but kids helping one another, different kids pushing each other on the swings, different kids, you know, playing soccer, all that diversity represented on the playground. So I think at some level, we're modeling that in the classroom by respecting the diversity in the classroom through the texts that we use, the practices that we adopt. But we can also do that for the school as a community and by bringing in parents and modeling for the parents the kind of school you hope to have. And then you'll see this in the playground. And if parents come and they come and observe kids as they do, they help out in the playground, this is what they're going to see, and that's what you need to reinforce. And that still isn't the whole society, but at some level for a kid, that is almost their world. Their world is the school and is the family and a little bit beyond that. So you're going a fair distance to make that happen. But it's a very important point, a very important point. Other conversations, other points? Yes?
We talked about how, as a teacher, sometimes, well, you have to make sure that all of your students see themselves in the stories. I think Mr. Walker talked about that. And sometimes as a teacher, you remember books that you read as a student and how you love those stories and you want to share them with the class, but they might not reach all of your students.
Yes.
So you need to make sure that even though you might think a book is good for you and students of your similar identity, that it might not reach all students.
Yeah. Now that's a very good point, but what I would say, quite frankly, that if kids see their teachers loving reading, that's important too. There's nothing like a teacher coming in with books. Now, of course, with older kids, you would be reading different kinds of books, but still to say, I read a great story last night. And just the fact that, gee, people enjoy reading, people choose to read, is already, I think, a very important model for those kids. So I think you're absolutely right. The things that you enjoy, the kids may not. Some may enjoy, some may not. But the very fact that you say, I love reading, and you can say, like, you have a book club. You can say, we talk about books. Some people like it, some people don't, and that's fine, because we relate to books in different ways. But the point is that we are engaged in reading, and we share what we enjoy, and we also respect that we may not all, So you might even, for that matter, even have little reading groups, during recess, where kids will be reading stories that they love, and they can be swapping and sharing and talking and disagreeing. There's nothing, and in fact, teaching kids to not exactly disagree, but to take a different position is fine. It's a healthy thing. So it's also about respecting that, some people may like things that they may not like, which is fine. But I think the modeling is what's important, so thank you for that. Yes?
Going along with the same how she already left, we were talking how important is not just to have all kind of books and bilingual books, but also that the teacher is actually the bridge between the students and any identity or the student and any love for reading and learning to write.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the thing is, you raised the question about what happens outside the classroom. At some level, there's a limit to what teachers can control outside the classroom. But what we can control as much as possible is the safety of the classroom. So that the classroom is, in a sense, almost an imagined space of safety, where kids can enjoy, they can be a little different, they can maybe disagree, but there's a safety around that. And they also learn how to perhaps disagree or how to take their turn and how to listen and how to follow instructions. And I think that we as teachers can control that to some extent. Other points, yes?
Was David's use of the stories, that is as a stimulus for talking and writing, is that the typical use?
No, I don't. That's one use, absolutely. That's one use. Because what we did, well, when I was teaching it was we were, when I say teaching, it's funny, teaching reading, was just enjoying the story. So as one does with all stories, before we even started reading, I enjoy. For example, I said to kids, what do you enjoy? What do you, and then kids would talk about the stuff that they enjoy. And then when we started to read, then we would be able to say, oh, this is like you, Penina, you enjoyed, And so there's that connection. What you're doing is immediately building that connection. And then what else do you think she might enjoy? So you're trying to anticipate. So you are, in fact, developing reading skills, right? And the ability to predict information. And you might even, before you get to the end of that story, you might say, how do you think, what would be a nice ending to the story? As we know, these are all just good reading practices. So reading, you absolutely are reading, and you might go back and read you may go back and read the story a number of times, one being just enjoy the story. In fact, that should be your number one. Let's just enjoy the story. Then you might go back and look at some of the repetition, for example. Or you might go back and see words that might be a little more challenging for kids and say, you know, for spelling purposes, for example. Or you might be developing vocabulary. Let's look at utensils. And let's think, how many utensils were there? And you might write them down. And you might say, well, what utensils are in your home that are not here? So, you know, certainly you can use it as a stimulus. But so there's, you know, you use the reading as, in a sense, an organic relationship to learning. But I think the first and most important is just enjoy the story. What is the story? What is she doing? Why? Yeah.
Well, then was his use is that very unusual to go to the writing step?
Well, I'd love to know. You tell me.
With the implementation in Africa.
Oh, in Africa. Well, you know, the thing that's a challenge in Africa, you know, I know it sounds, is that there are often very few writing materials. I mean, it's as simple as that. You know, I've been in schools, like elementary schools, where there are literally 80 kids and not even a pencil, not even a piece of paper. So while I think that many teachers would love to perhaps take it to that stage, simply the resources, you know, of paper and pencil is not available in many, many schools. Where there would be paper and pencil, absolutely, yes, I've no doubt people would be taking this and doing all kinds of interesting work with it. But that's the reality of poverty. And that's why, you know, you find that many African children might be very strong orally. You know, lots of discussion, lots of debate, but they often do not have the resources. You know, they do not have the... And I mean, it's very interesting that David, like, sent home those texts to the parents and how excited the parents were when they saw it. That's something that would be very hard to do in the African context because, you know... And so, therefore, you can see the challenges of how do you bring the community in when something as simple as, you know, as crayons may not be available. So we take these things for granted here, you know, we do, but we cannot in other contexts. Yes?
In Africa, can they use the create your own African storybook?
Yes.
Instead of because they don't have access to paper and pencils and everything so frequently, but if they have access to the website, can they then create, because you have to create your own...
That's right. Now, of course, yes, absolutely. Now, of course, when you create a story, you need, you know, you need the internet, and therefore you need money. So quite frankly, if somebody's going to be involved in creation, first of all, it tends to be teachers because little kids are really too little. Although a teacher might be inspired by kids. Like I would be very inspired to take some of these and create a picture out of, you know, a story out of these. But normally it would be the teacher because kids are, first of all, not able to, and secondly, don't have the resources. So it would require a teacher and some resources for a teacher to be able to do that. And yeah, so it's a good question, but that is one of the challenges, yes. Oh yes, it has been, absolutely, absolutely. There's some wonderful stories. I was working with one of my colleagues from UBC who's in Mozambique, who was in Mozambique for a year, and she came back and she had accumulated all these wonderful stories from Mozambique. And so she has now uploaded onto the African Storybook Project a whole lot of Mozambican stories in Xitswa and Portuguese and certainly other African languages. So it's incredibly exciting. It took time and energy, you know, but it was wonderful. Yes.
I'm curious as to the age range of both the writers and the readers in your African Storybook project.
Okay, so the readers can go, quite frankly, you know, the funny thing is, I like that, I enjoy. And how old am I, right? But anyway, it is geared towards younger readers, obviously emergent readers, right? The whole, you know, from kindergarten and younger, in libraries, right, to maybe 7, 8, so to speak, around about that age. But the reality is that many children who are, as we see from that one slide, 16 years old who've never learned to read. So then you have to start thinking, well, should we, like I Love Clouds, quite frankly. There's nothing wrong with that. You could do an I Love Clouds, and a 16-year-old could read that. And there would be other stories as well that would be good for, beginning readers who are older. So reading is something that doesn't belong to an age group in a sense, although it certainly is geared for those kids beginning. And as David says, the simple stories to begin with. And certainly when you translate it to writing, the kids are developing. And it's interesting, he said that as kids begin to read more, in a sense they will develop their writing as well. Yeah, but the whole idea is that, how they say when kids from grade 1 to grade 4, they learn to read and then they read to learn, right? You've heard that. So this is very much the learn to read, but you want them to enjoy reading so that they will do more and more reading on their own and see themselves as readers. And so why the transition from the book to the story, the equivalent, right, is in a sense the student to the reader. I think that's what you want, the identity of the reader. Yes?
Dr. Martin, could you talk a little bit about the selection process of the texts that are published on the website?
Yes.
Because it seems, if I understand this correctly, anyone can create a text and submit it, but some are collected and then published.
Yes.
And I just wondering what the criteria is for
Yes.
that selection.
Well, it's an interesting question because that's one of the things that we are battling with a little bit. On the one hand, you want to make sure that everybody feels very happy to contribute, and everybody does. But what we're thinking of moving into is that we might move into what we call authorized texts. Because, for one thing, as a quality control measure, as simple as that, right? Because there may be some stories that people want to put up for whatever reason, but for whatever reason we might feel is troubling or feel there may be too many inaccuracies. We might feel the modeling might be troubling, So what we're trying to grapple with is that notion of the authorized text, so that we'll say this text has been authorized. So if a teacher says, you know what, for the moment I'm just going to deal with authorized texts because there are too many for me to kind of go through to try and find something that would be useful, they would do that. So that's how we're trying to deal with that, the authorized text. Yeah. Any other comments? Questions? Yes.
Have any of the pilot sites that you have collaborated with like classrooms or schools from other countries that have higher literacy rates, like almost in a pen pal
Yes.
measure to encourage other students in Africa to read?
Sure. I mean, we absolutely, that is something we would absolutely love to do. And I myself have tried to do that as well in the Canadian context and have, what the challenge is to make that connection, quite frankly. We can do that almost like if I happen to be flying to Uganda, I'll take a whole lot of stuff with me and I'll go back and fly back and I'll take stuff. But because the internet is still not sufficiently well established, especially in the rural areas, that's hard to do. But in urban areas, when where there are resources, yes, we absolutely are looking at that kind of connection. What we have to, of course, balance that against is, of course, these kids are very young right now, and I would think it might be more appropriate perhaps when they're a little bit older, and perhaps have a little, perhaps at least grade 4, 5, so to speak, and have started to produce their own text, and there's that possibility, because the kids definitely very interested in what is happening in the world around them. And I think having that kind of pen pal, but the digital pen pal, is a lovely idea. But it does require, of course, a fair bit of organization and commitment on both sides. But, absolutely can be done when the energy is there. Yes, should we take our last question? Okay, this is our, pressure.
No, I was just wondering, so let's say I'm in Africa and I'm in a small village. How do I find out, or how does the African Storybook Project find its way to me other than someone in the village who has the internet to access Google's and finds out about it? Like, how are you getting the word out throughout Africa, and who are you collaborating with while you're doing that to make sure that it's spreading?
Absolutely. And if we have, I don't know if we have a moment, but maybe I'll try and do this. I don't want to waste time, but let me see if I pull this up. I'm going to go to the African Storybook Project, because so what we find, so here we have a website. This is the website. And in fact, if you go to our research here, you'll see, if those of you might be interested in research, as I say, I'm the research advisor, and we also have a blog site actually. And on that blog, we're having all kinds of conversations about digital and print stories. And here there's a Malay teaching project that's happening, some UNESCO's latest report on mobile devices. So lots of conversations that are going on. But if we go back to, we can go, let's just go back here. Let's see if we go back here to, yeah, let's see, I'm going to have to go, I'll go back to the, just go back here. So if we go about us, what we see here is our team, the steering committee, stories, pilot sites, and we've also got our partners. And so we have many, many partners. We've got partners in Kenya, South Africa, and Uganda, clearly. But also, if you have a look, that's Uganda. And then we've got other countries. Code, Center for Promotion of Literacy, Friends of African Village Libraries, Grace Rwanda, Pratt & Books India, San Francisco, Room to Read, I don't know if these are familiar, TESA program in England, Translators Without Borders, UBC World Reader, some of you might be familiar with some of these. These are our partners, and this is absolutely how we're trying to get the word out. And I try wherever I possibly can to get the word out, because in a sense the website is there already. It's in every single country. It's just a question of getting access. And the stories are all there, and we've got about 200 stories now, which is really amazing, you know, that for learning purposes. So we're doing it through word of mouth, we're doing it at conferences, we're doing it through publication, and through YouTube. I've got my own YouTube channel. I put everything up on YouTube when I can. In fact, this video is probably going to go up on YouTube as well, if we can, if it all works. Because one of the things people are wanting to know is not only about the story, but about how do you teach the stories. And so it was so wonderful to have David coming to talk about how he teaches the stories, because I think that would be really helpful to have that on the website as well. So it's there. It's basically there for everybody. And we keep refining and improving the website. And if you, for example, would like to translate any of these stories into French, if any French speakers here, we'd love to get more French out there, because we've got West Africa to deal with. So please spread the word, anybody in French. But if you happen to know an African language or know people who speak an African language, then you can start translating any of these stories. Part of what you do here, part of what we do in the stories, if we go to here, so that's translate and adapt African stories. You can take any one of those stories that are out there, and you can choose, and you can then you can translate it. So that would be a huge contribution. So I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you very much for that. Thanks, Dee.